Since I was about 13 years old, I've been reading business books, listening to business podcasts, watching videos. I'm 18 now, but thing that always frustrated me was you'd cover stories of success and victories, and they'd talk about how founder X had built his startup and exited for 2 billion and this and that, but they'd never really talk about the failures, the bad parts, the ugly parts. And if they did, they'd gloss over it. They wouldn't take their guests to those moments. They wouldn't really talk too much about it. Recent years, it's gotten a little better. Some have talked about failures, but we still don't talk about it much. And so, one of the things that I seek to do with this show and this podcast is show you the values of despair, take you to those moments just as much as you hear about the achievements. Two of my last guests, one had built a company to $1 billion in revenue, the other had sold a company to 2 billion to IBM. But we spent a good deal of the podcast talking about his alcoholic habits, or one being thrown in the puddle when he had no money at 22 by security guards that he was trying to, in the building that he was trying to sell to. So that's what I want to do with this podcast. Today's guest, he's an interesting guy. He started building startups out of college, raised $1 million for, I believe, a travel app. Didn't work out. Did a podcast, did a few different things. We'll cover the full story. Joined Google, corporate route didn't really work out. And then started another company, an AI company, got into Combinator, raised from David Sachs and all these cool VC funds. That also didn't really work out. So now he's on his third startup. And the reason I wanted him was because he's real. You go to his website, you go to Landon Sanford, it's real, it's raw. You go to especially the real me part, he doesn't hide it, which I admire, I respect. I think we need more of that. That's why I want to tell a story. So without further ado, Landon, welcome to the Builders of Funders show.
Thanks for having me on. Good to be here.
Absolutely. I want to start with, I think, the man that influenced your life, your father. I just want to briefly talk about his impact on you, lessons you've learned from him, how he shaped you. For those that don't know, your father was a presidential candidate, two-time governor of South Carolina, six-time congressman, all around amazing guy, very well accomplished. Tell me about growing up with a father that was a politician and kind of the attention that brought to your family. And what lesson did you learn? How did he shape you as a man?
Yeah, good question. I feel like I could cover a lot. I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is he was without a doubt a dreamer and still is. And he would introduce us to tons of people growing up and always, even as little kids, say, you can do that or you can be that or whatever that person's job was or role was that you just met, like you can do that. Like a lot of these people aren't any, smarter or different than you. And so I'd say one word that comes to mind, just related to my dad and just upbringing, was that kind of just dreamer mentality that he kind of helped shape from an early age to uh, yeah, just to believe in myself and reach for more and kind of swing big.
Absolutely. And then I think out of college, you decide to build this travel app. You raise $1 million. I'd love to hear the story behind that travel app. Why did you decide to build it in the first place? And then, how did you raise $1 million as like a college student? I bet that would have been quite difficult.
It was, and it was a fun journey. I've got a lot of kind of thoughts from it, and a lot of first time founder mistakes that were part of it, and even the idea itself was very much a first time founder idea. YC kind of, it's in that category of like tar pit ideas that YC labels, but I thought it was a blast. I'd say the initial starting point was more so born out of necessity, in terms of the job that I had lined up got canceled when I had this big knee injury. I had double knee surgery, and so that forced me back home, instead of moving to Austin to work for this startup, and was looking at 8 months ahead, recovering from double knee surgery, didn't have everything lined up, and that kind of led me to say, like, I'm gonna start something, figure out something, and led to that idea. I'd always loved travel and traveled a lot, and longer story in terms of how it actually started and got off the ground, but that's kind of the short version. Was just had a lot of time and nothing else, and really wanted to start something. It felt like the perfect time to go for it.
Interesting. So you're sitting there, you're thinking, all right, this job thing is gone. I've got lots of time on my hands. What am I going to do? Well, I like traveling. You come up with this idea. You've got concepts of this idea. Where do you go from there? How did you actually build it out of college? Like, did you go and learn how to code? Like, take me to that moment that, let's go down memory lane and like take me to Landon then. Like, what did he do to start executing on this?
Yeah, I guess Landon then did not know a lot about startups. So I started with thinking I need to keep it a secret or get people to sign NDAs before I learned that kind of the opposite is true. I started with just quickly rushing to build something versus talking to users or trying to validate the concept or prototype. I started working with some people, and then that didn't work out. So then I shifted to dev shop, and that didn't work out. And then eventually found a team and got the ball rolling. But that just took a while, a lot of trial and error. And then even on the funding side, like for a while, it was just nothing. I did it with a buddy from college for a bit, and then I think things started to turn when I found someone else who traveled a lot and really believed in the concept and problem, and worked with him, and then found a great CTO, and then that kind of got a little bit of validation to then raise some money. We won like a pitch competition, and then kind of went from there. But it was a ton of just I didn't know what I was doing, and just kind of figuring it out as I went. I didn't learn to code. I think that probably would have been a great thing to do. Would have been to learn how to code. It was more on the really on the sales kind of like pitching people to either join the team or to invest or support the concept in some kind of way. And then the concept itself shifted a bunch of times as we progressed too.
So it seems like the people that you were able to recruit were kind of the big inflection point, or like the thing that allowed you to really progress and start getting the ball rolling. How did you meet those people? You mentioned you meet one gentleman who's kind of he's into traveling as well. He believes in the concept. Then you find a CTO. How did you actually meet those people? And then how did you convince them? Because like you're still a kid out of college, and you don't necessarily like. How did you pitch? How did you convince them to come on this journey with you?
I kind of just emailed just hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and some the people that were in the very small pool that responded or expressed interest or were up to chat and discuss. Um, Same with a lot of the investors. It was just I was just finding different ways to just email or connect with more and more people. Yeah, I guess the first person was the travel guy. He'd been to every country in the world, and so I found him on Instagram and then messaged him. And then same with their CTO. I think it was actually through connection through a co-founder that had just joined the team. And he had just the timing worked out with some of them where it aligned great. Um, we raised about $1 million, but same kind of thing of a lot of first time founder issues on spending money on things we didn't need. I think we built up the team way too quickly. Um, I think only towards the end when we were running out of money did I then email almost every person I could in this space and asking for them why things in this space are very hard to pull off or why they fail, or like I emailed the founder of Foursquare and TripAdvisor and Yelp and all these different people in tangential spaces that a year before then I thought if I emailed them they'd steal the idea, but they were actually incredibly helpful and really insightful and had great insight. So yeah, so I guess the short answer is like I didn't have any credibility, so it was really just kind of a numbers game mixed with kind of playing like the desperation card of I'm a recent college graduate. I know you have no reason to respond, but here's why I'm reaching out XYZ and try to make all of them as personalized as possible.
You mentioned that you were emailing the CEOs of TripAdvisor and all these other big companies in your space. What did you actually learn from their responses? First, what was that email that you were sending them, and then what did they respond with? What do you think the big learning there was from their responses?
Uh, a lot of I think a lot of like the lessons I learned were very specific to the space. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, it depended on the person. So all of them were kind of like very personalized, and then I'd follow up with a lot of them on a regular basis. Um, with that concept, I guess the short version is it felt like we had a lot of users, but no one was paying or no one was like retention was terrible. So I was wondering from a lot of people what they would do if they're in my shoes. And for a lot of them, they said, it's kind of two different realms in the travel space. It's either if you focus on like more just travel, you've got to be able to monetize it right away, and we weren't doing that. And usually with monetization within travel platforms, it all goes towards hotels or experiences because that's where the best margin is. Or if it's more in like the social realm, it's got to be used like every day or a couple times a week. And we were kind of in a dead zone of neither one. And they said if it's more of like the social route, ideally start with the youngest audience possible and the densest audience possible, in a localized area, which is usually like a college campus or high school or something like that. So when we were running out of money, we were exploring some of these different, some of those lessons on on I think we would have I wanted to go more in like the experiences, kind of like bookable experiences kind of route, but by that point in time we didn't have a lot of money left. We'd already spent it on a lot of things we didn't need. So it all goes back to just learning. At the end of the day, just learned a lot from those emails and conversations, but also just from the experience itself.
And at what point did you decide, all right, this thing is not really gonna, it's not really gonna work out. We're trying to solve retention. We're trying to solve the monetization. It's not. At what point do you go, maybe it's time to pivot. Maybe it's time to stop doing this.
uh I don't think ever. I don't think I ever kind of had that kind of moment. I think I'm stubborn, and I think there's some quotes about like the startup only fails when the founder gives up, and I think I took that to heart. Um, so for me, it was kind of a weird situation where I had a co-founder who offered to put in money if I left and I became an advisor, and I said yes to that, and but still believe there's something there. So I think if I did it again, though, it would have been much more um, rapid, kind of like launching or learning or diving deeper, or and like even just looking back at the designs for some of the stuff we launched, we just got way too caught up into adding features and small nitpicky types of changes and tweaks rather than really exploring stuff that was just fundamentally different. I probably would have dreamed a bit bigger too. Like I was surprised on my next startup, it was much easier raising funding on something that felt yeah, just way more different in terms of like an AI platform versus something that was like one of a thousand other travel apps. And so no. So I guess to answer your question, there wasn't really like a clear moment. It was more so, let's we're running out of money. Let's just do this kind of change or tweak, but we're going to keep it going. Um, and then once I left that, then I feel like I started opening up to other ideas and other kind of possible routes. But still very much thought about that concept, and still have ideas kind of tangential to it. So it was all kind of a weird kind of process in general, but super great. I mean, the team we had we had a lot of fun together, and can't speak highly enough of all of them for all kind of taking a bet on it all.
You mentioned what happened with your co-founder, where you had a bit of a split. To the extent you're comfortable with revealing, what happened there, and what do you think you learned with about managing those co-founder relationships?
Um, with well, I mean, I had a couple different co-founders through that business, and then through businesses since then. I'd say the general kind of lessons I've learned in that process would be try to have the hard conversations up front rather than down the road. Startups are very much exciting and based on momentum. So when you've got like energy and excitement, it feels like you're just hitting the ground running, and it feels like there won't be harder times ahead. So, but it's usually in those moments or the earlier moments where you try to get on the same page as much as possible, or navigate how you're going to deal with disagreements or conflicts or down moments, which inevitably come. Um, so yeah, I'd say those were some of the lessons in general, as well as like even just I like trying to do some kind of like trial before doing a full kind of co-founder engagement now. I think that's a good practice. Um, Complementary skill sets, like really knowing who owns kind of what departments or channels, and trying to not have too much overlap. But there was with that concept, so there was nothing. There was no bad beef in terms of. It was like we kept talking even after I left that, and kept being engaged for months, even after that. So a lot of that was more more so tied to just the financial um, condition of the business that necessitated some sort of shift from that. But yeah, a lot of lessons with co-founder dynamics in general. I mean, they say in general, like startups die by suicide more than by murder, and it's usually from like internal conflicts rather than from like some external competitor.
And then I think you try going the corporate route. You go join Google. Then you decided to leave Google. You were a part of I think a stealth startup for some time, working with the Udemy co-founders. I'd love to kind of cover that part of your life a little bit as well. What happened there?
Yeah, ended up working at Google for a bit, and then ended up leaving that and working for a startup for a bit. It was also during 2020, so it was right when the pandemic. I was supposed to move out to San Francisco too, and then 3 days before my flight was when COVID started happening. And I think uh, the Google, like everyone I worked with at Google was really awesome, and they were also very flexible and like understanding with how much the role and starting a new role while a pandemic is starting is just kind of a weird spot in general. But there's a quote from I think from Naval Ravikant that says like once you've had a taste of freedom, it can make a person unemployable. And I think I resonate with that. Of there wasn't anything inherently bad with Google or anything going wrong. I just missed how much fun and how exciting startups were, and that's what led me to just kind of go back into that game.
Yeah, and then you mentioned working one on one or getting to work with one on one with one of the Udemy co-founders for a little bit. What was that experience like? What do you think you learned from him and kind of his approach towards fundraising and building a startup?
I learned a lot. He's great. It was yeah, I think when I was there, he raised 4 million, and I helped kind of work on his deck and investor outreach, and then shortly after I left, I think he raised another 20 million. But just seeing his process through everything and how he went about everything, and how he crafted some of the narratives and understanding it was really really great in terms of just learning a lot. I think I'd seen him post on Twitter that he was looking for a role or looking for someone to help him over the summer, and I kind of just acted like I started working before he hired me. Like I built a website and some other stuff and just sent it to, and just started sending him stuff just based on the limited knowledge of the space or industry that I saw that he was working on. And then we had a couple conversations and then started working together. Uh, but yeah, it was just a lot of fun.
That's fascinating. It's I think that's I've heard of a few friends that do that. It seems to be effective. Just do the work without the permission, and you give it to him. It seems to work. You mentioned you got to see a lot of his process and the way he thought about things. What do you think were some things you picked up that impacted you later on? What were some of those big lessons you learned with him?
It's a good question. I'd say just like how much depth and expertise you need within a startup to succeed. Of like within that, like it was an online education space, the startup, and he was teaching his own courses and taking like he was just fully all in from every angle, kind of like he was really kind of becoming an expert more and more in that specific vertical. And I think that was a big takeaway. Like it can be I'm guilty of this. It can be easy to think like, oh, run some ads on a website. That website does well, and now you're off to the races. And sometimes that can't happen, but for a lot of people, it is, like layers of an onion, and just kind of peeling deeper and deeper until you're the expert in that space. And the concept might shift, within that realm, but you know the ins and outs. And seeing him in that, like he knew the ins and outs even before he'd raised money. Like he'd already spent a year in that space doing a dozen different things, just become more of an expert.
I think during quite a bit of this, you were also traveling quite a bit. You mentioned traveling the world. You mentioned you like doing that. I think you also organize co-living spaces. I'm not going to ask you why you like traveling because I think the answer people can guess. But how do you think it's impacted you, or how do you think it's shaped you as a person? Like you're growing up in South Carolina, then you start going to all these countries. What did that do to shape you as a person? Like I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't know how
Yeah,
exactly to ask this, but yeah, I think you might get the point.
definitely. Uh, yeah, I don't know if I have a specific answer to that. Like one thing, I did work for a bit with a guy who'd been every country in the world, and one thing that stuck out when I talked with him was how empathetic he was, where he, talk about like if someone was being mentioned, he would be very quick, like, oh, that could have been his culture, his background, that kind of like help shape that decision, and in a very like uh, endearing and sympathetic way. And I think that's an aspect of travel. If it just kind of broadens your perspective and your understanding the world, where if you're fortunate enough to live in some different places, I think you just get a better understanding of where people are coming from. Yeah, that'd probably be my first kind of initial reaction. But I haven't thought about that. That's a good question.
Mhm. Another pattern I picked up with your life is you like asking for wisdom. I think when you were in college or towards then, you had emailed or reached out to a bunch of people. I think George Bush actually got back to you, and then you launched this other podcast asking of over 1,000 seniors about their life advice. And then you also go out there and you email TripAdvisor, CEO, et cetera, and you're reaching out to them. So that seems to be a pattern. Where did you pick up on that? Like, there's a lot of people out there, and like they know they need advice and wisdom from those who've got more experience, but they're not always thinking, well, maybe I should just reach out to them. Where do you think that came from? Did you at what point do you pick that up, or you think it just naturally occurred to you that like you could just reach out to people and just like say something and they'd respond?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the category. Like, I feel like with that senior citizen project, it was just, having a great conversation with my grandmother and wanting more conversations like that. And I happened to be, um, both having some travel and some free time where I could do that. And then in the business realm, that was more out of like necessity of not having anything going and needing to, out of desperation, try to get something going. And so you're willing to do anything to try to make that happen. And that entails usually just emailing and reaching out to a lot of people. So yeah, kind of, I'd say it's kind of a context dependent answer, dependent on who you're reaching out to or why. But then once you start doing that, or people do respond, or if you do get a response from George Bush or whatever, it kind of opens you up, like of like, oh, maybe other people are going to respond. So I'd say um, it could have been more of maybe felt more like acceptable just after a couple different people responded early on in that journey.
Hmm. Something I've been thinking about a lot is I think Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, had this quote of, he made this mistake of asking for almost too much advice, and he cared a little too much about the elders, with or like what people older than him and more experienced than him said. Looking back, you do the elders, the senior citizens project. You ask them about their life advice. You're at one point, getting response from George Bush, and you're getting compiling all this advice. You're getting this advice from the CEOs of these big companies, and you're getting very contextual advice. Do you think people, or like I noticed that especially with my generation, we look for a lot of information, but then that information often ends up overwhelming us, and you're like, well, what should I do? And sometimes you look at the lives of the biggest innovators, they kind of just hate advice. Like, don't give me advice, I'm gonna do what I think is
Yeah.
right, I'm gonna follow my intuition. Looking back, and again, I'm thinking out loud here, I don't really have a solid shaped question. I'm just kind of thinking through with you here. Like, do you think
Yeah.
maybe it's a little overrated to ask for that much advice, or do you think sometimes it's worth following your intuition, or like, do you think it was worth it asking for all that advice?
I think that's a great question. I think uh, it depends, but even I mean, while you were talking, the first thing that came to mind was my last startup. I was trying to think of what to do next, and I was emailing a lot of investors of like, what do you think between this idea and this idea and this idea? And at the end of the day, it's there isn't like a perfect idea, and a lot of times it is just like you just launch something or you just start, and like that's the harder part. And then the stars are never going to perfectly align, and I think a lot of times too much information can breed inaction or just kind of like overthinking, like you mentioned, and just having um, wanting to get more of a consensus or more opinion to then get the perfect kind of decision. And a lot of times you just learn by doing, you learn by action. And I think it was Ryan Chesky who says, no, maybe someone else, but says that like startups are like sharks, and you just got to keep swimming. Or I think someone else, maybe it's a Spotify founder, talked about how like startup is like climbing a mountain, but it's really foggy, and you can only kind of see by like as you take more steps up the mountain, you can see a little bit more of the steps in front of you. And I think if you ask too much information, it's like you're standing still and kind of frozen on what's next. When sometimes you just gotta go forward without knowing everything or without having the perfect idea or whatever that might be.
Mhm. Maybe you don't have a perfect answer to this, but I kind of still want to ask, where do you think that fine balance is between, asking for advice and asking for too much advice, or overwhelming yourself with too much information and then that reading in action? Where do you think that balance? And again, it's totally fine if you don't have an answer. I don't know that anyone really has a right answer to this question, but I'm curious what you might see as that kind of like fine balance, because you've executed. You don't stay in the theory phase, but then you still also ask for advice. And like, how do you filter that, or how do you draw that line?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer on that. I feel like it depends on what the decision is, and sometimes it is a gut feeling. Um, um, but yeah, probably some kind of mix um, of trying to ask people and be open minded. Like I think especially like my first startup, well, I still ask for people, but a lot of times I was very, very stubborn or just very overly confident on like this is the route or this is the path. So probably could have like talked with more, startup specific people when I was in that phase. But yeah, I think I don't think there's a clear cut formula to it. I think it's all, trying to do a little bit of both, and you learn as you go and make decisions. It won't be perfect, but that's okay.
Yeah, one of the things I want to ask you about is going back. We were talking about your first startup. I think at one point you told me that you were driving. You were an Uber driver right before you guys won that pitch competition. Made I think $100,000 or won $100,000 from it. You had to go work Uber and kind of make those sacrifices. I know we kind of brushed over that first startup or that part of that journey. I want to go back and talk about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I was doing a couple different things. I drove Uber for a bit. I did some freelancing jobs. I had a full-time job for a bit and then left for after like 3 or 4 months. So I was trying different things, trying to balance both of them, one or the other. And uh it was not fun. I guess it's all kind of like a blur because it was a while ago now. But uh yeah, it's I think some of that can be good in terms of like when you're all in. Like I was very much all in on that startup, versus when it feels like it's much harder to be in that phase of all in versus when you might have like way better opportunities to that are enticing. I didn't really have that, so that kind of required me to you know be all in and try to get other stuff going. But I think that um, yeah, I think that can be good, and but it's also just tough in general. And if any founders are going through that right now, listen to this. I feel for you because it's not fun.
Why do you think you mentioned you're stubborn? You mentioned that you had heard this quote that startups don't fail unless the founders don't quit. Why do you think you're able to maintain that conviction? I mean, yeah, you're hearing the quotes, all this stuff, but like you're still you're driving Uber and you're doing all this stuff. What made you go? You know what? I have to maintain this, or like what were you telling yourself in those valleys of despair, or like moments of depression? How did you get yourself out, or was there some more quotes that you would read to yourself, or like stories that really stuck by you about founders that went through something similar?
Yeah, I think I mean, I'd say in general, just like I think I would just try to laugh about it all. Like I thought it was funny. I was driving Uber, instead of I think I at one point had a good offer in investment banking in New York. There's funny moments I thought about that when things aren't going well. But I thought I was just trying to have fun with like I would try to have a mindset where like just trying to enjoy the journey, or this is going to make for a better story at some point down the road. And then with founders as well. I feel like I'd met enough founders to think that like to truly believe that like I could do that, or watch a lot of enough videos of founders talking about their own journey that like I think just a hard path is kind of the norm and not the exception. So I think knowing some of those, I probably did. I think I had a quote or like some quotes kind of by my workspace station or by my bed or something like that. I don't remember any of them specifically, but I'd say in general, just knowing that plenty of stories of founders who had pushed through far harder circumstances than the ones I was going through, mixed with as well, just trying to view the downside as and just kind of a lighthearted way of like things are gonna be fine, even if this startup doesn't work out, or even if I'm still driving Uber for a while or whatever, like it's all gonna be fine at the end of the day.
Hmm. And then what about your second startup with Compose AI? How did you? What's the story there, and how did you like get into YC and you're raising from David Sachs and everything? How did that work?
Yeah, it was I was at a founder's house in Mexico, and uh, some of us kind of hit it off, and then long story short, ended up working together. We went to YC together, and yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was pre ChatGPT, so it was, and it was an AI startup, so it was very much kind of a good timing to be working on something like that. Um, and yeah, it was it astounded me how much easier it was, not easier, but just it felt way more downhill rather than uphill. Of like working on a travel out felt just every dollar raised felt so hard fought, and high and all these other things versus something like Compose. I felt like the wind was at your back a little bit, where it felt easier to raise and it felt easier to get momentum and all these other things. And I think some of that might have just been because it was just a far more different idea or a far differentiated kind of concept. Like I think with venture backed startups specifically, because they're investing based on a power law. So for every 100 investments, they might want one or two to hit it big. Um, and so I think most venture backable concepts are either like they're easier if it's either like crazy in the sense of like super futuristic, future differentiated, creating its own category, whatever that might be, or touching on some sort of desperation where it's clear and obvious that people really want whatever you're building or selling, and it's one of those two. And if it's not, then it can just be a tougher path. And so, I think that was a big takeaway just from that startup was just some of that kind of wind at your back versus wind at your face kind of momentum.
How do you, if you're starting out right now, how do you kind of discern? Is it just about getting reps in, do you think? Like where you can discern if what you're doing is going to be uphill or downhill? Or what are some things you look at that would tell you, all right, this idea, it's like a tar pit idea, or it's going to be this, or how do you kind of, maybe differentiate that?
Yeah, I'm still asking myself that now because I left Compose AI and thought like, okay, the more different, the better. I was thinking through some crazy ideas, but I think it's an overlap. Or like in general, I've heard of kind of two main approaches when it comes to startup ideas. One is um, kind of inward versus outward. One is more of a look inward on like, maybe you travel for a year, see what ideas keep coming back to you. You might not be able to, in a position to travel for a year, but this I think is something that like Naval had said of like take time and see what ideas keep or spaces or problems keep coming back to you. Um, and that's probably where there's more kind of founder market fit or alignment with something you intrinsically care about. And the other is kind of more throw stuff at the wall, move as fast as possible, keep launching stuff, don't hold on to anything too tightly, and keep launching until something hits or something really resonates. And I think I've shifted back and forth between both of them. Now I think it's kind of an overlap. Now I think it is kind of an overlap of concentric circles of like what are you really good at, or what do you have an unfair advantage in, mixed with what do you really care about or spaces you think you could work 10 years on, because every startup is definitely a 10-year journey, if it does work, mixed with like what are the current trends, or what does this space or industry look like in 5 years or 10 years or things like that. So yeah, so I don't have a clear answer on this because it's something that I feel like I've gone back and forth on like a dozen different times. Um, So yeah, but in general, I'd say like the default answer would just be just same as before. Is just kind of like start launching, and you learn as you go.
Why do you think Compose AI didn't work out, or thing you worked on for like 11 months and didn't really pan out? What do you think went wrong there?
Uh, it's still going. I would argue that it has worked out in terms of I think it's got over 1 million users. I left before. Yeah, but yeah, I think they're still going strong with it.
Mhm. Why did, if you don't, mind telling the answer, why did you leave?
The short answer would be just kind of co-founder differences. I ended up leaving and taking some time off, and then working on a new startup. But yeah, they're still going with it.
hmm And then now I think you're on your third startup. I'm curious, what do you think keeps you going now? You mentioned, we talked about the freedom aspect. You know, it's like a lot of people by now would have gone, had a job or applied for a bunch of jobs, or maybe they would have gone and worked at an early stage startup, still get the same feel. What keeps you going? What's that vision you're thinking? Are you thinking, well, I have to prove this wrong, or like, is it like the chip on the shoulder, I just have to succeed thing, or is it like you're just motivated by the journey, you don't really care about the success, or what do you think is still powering you to keep trying a bunch of stuff? Because I think you had 5 or 8 different startup ideas that you never raised money for, but still kind of worked on and tested with. Why keep going?
Yeah, good question. Sure, the first thing that comes to mind is I just find it fun. Like it doesn't feel like work to me, and I enjoy the process. And I do think I'm learning. Like I do think um I like with each swing and with each year and with each launch, I feel like I learn little bit by little bit, either about startups in general or about a specific space or vertical or industry. So kind of a mix of that. Yeah, that probably would be my first. Other jobs that I've done for a little bit just felt like jobs, and this doesn't like that's where it could be very well that I'm still saying this in 30 years and none of the startups have worked out, but that feels fine to me. If like I think uh I enjoy the journey, but I do think I'll get one to work out. And Yeah, so I think kind of a mix between those different factors. But I'd say that the high level realm would be that it's fun, but also feeling like I have learned a lot over the last couple of years and wanting to apply that. And I think the best way for me to apply that is as a founder, more so than as like an early stage employee or something like that.
Hmm. Last thing I want to ask you about is what's in it for the future? What do you, when you look ahead at the next 20, 30 years, what are you seeing Landon doing, and what's kind of your vision? I know you're on your third startup. If you want to talk a little bit about what you're building there.
Wow, next 20, 30 years. Uh, I don't know what I mean, I think the world's going to change a lot in the next 20, 30 years. I mean, already with how quickly things are moving in AI and robotics and all these other spaces. It's fascinating to just imagine what the world might look like in 20 or 30 years. There's also negative aspects. I think the US is about to go through a very tough kind of time period with a sovereign debt crisis and potential inflation or currency debasement kind of crisis. So a mix of different factors that are both positive and negative in the short to medium term. Um, and I think that could all impact very much just what I build or what I do or whatever it might be. Right now we're working on some, it's very early stages, raise a little money, just 5 of us, but in the AI space. Um, One thing with Compose AI that we ran into is when we launched, I think we got like 1 million users, but there were like 12 other copycats pretty quickly, and a lot of platforms started doing their own kind of like similar kind of concept. It felt very crowded very quickly. So what we're working on now is a big swing. So it will be, I think, either a big hit or a big miss. But what I like about it is I don't think anyone else is doing anything similar, and that's something with both my first, especially my first startup, but also second startup. It felt like it got crowded kind of quickly. So I like that with this kind of realm. But if this one doesn't work out, I could see myself trying to just do a bootstrap startup for a bit, or switch to some other route for a bit. But who knows? I enjoy the journey. So either way, I think over the next 20, 30 years, there'll still be a lot more startups to come, and I think I'm so early in the process. Either way.
Hmm. To the extent you can reveal, why do you think the second co-founder split up happened with Compose AI? Obviously, there are going to be things that you're not going to want to reveal, but like to the extent, what do you think the lesson there was, or how would you, looking back, have avoided such a thing happening? Because it is still a successful company, just didn't work out, or like you had to like what happened there. What do you think the big lesson there was for you, looking back, reflecting on it?
Yeah, I'd say if there's any blame, like all the blame would be on me. I don't want to speak bad of the team. I think the team is great. But I think it was kind of what I mentioned of like in hindsight, I would have had some more of those harder conversations right up front. I think with that one especially, it was like it won a hackathon and then suddenly got into YC, and then when you're into YC, it's like you're off to the races. And that punted a lot of like our conversations to post demo day, post raise. Let's chat about some of these after raise, and I think it would have been better to just have some of those conversations up front and try to get more on the same page early on, versus a feeling of like, you know, got to move quickly, and we'll have all these conversations later on. I don't know if that makes sense.
What were some of those hard conversations that you had to have later on, or what were some of those conversations that you were postponing?
It can be either big or small stuff. It could be conversations just about long-term goal of the company, a desired outcome of the company, desired culture, desired, in-person, remote, equity, like a mix of just kind of anything, big or small. I think, but I think, yeah, and even I think YC and some of those others now have some like kind of like co-founder questions to go through. I think some of those could be good if you haven't worked with the person before or know each other's working style or things like that. Like I think a lot of those just can be good practices.